Hey ladies, welcome to chapter 8 of The Wounded Heart. This chapter is called Secondary Symptoms. It begins with saying that sexual abuse, or any kind of abuse, obviously do not just devastate the internal world, because whatever happens on the inside is going to eventually affect our outside world, even observable to others. Many abuse victims might claim that no sense of past abuse has damaged their lives, and to some degree this might be partially true. If the category that we use to evaluate this term, no effect, is broad enough, then yes, many abuse victims do not show clear, measurable consequences that came from abuse. He gives the example here of a woman who he knew was abused by several people, and she argued that her growth in her spirituality had removed all damage of past abuse. She quoted a Bible verse that stated, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come." Allender says that her life did look symptom-free. She was not depressed. She was not sexually inactive. She did not seem unfulfilled or undisciplined or struggling with a poor self-image. She typically felt pretty in control of her world, and if she filled out a questionnaire about the effects of abuse, she would absolutely be an example of someone who survived trauma and abuse and did not have consequences from that. But he says that if the categories of measurement were to be a little more refined and based on an outsider's observation, then this woman's evaluation might be somewhat inaccurate, because her marriage was actually affected by an overbearing tone. She was quite opinionated, but sometimes this bordered on being insensitive. Her manner was kind, but it was formal and uninviting. She saw herself as a submissive spiritual woman, and she thought that her perspective was simply penetrating and accurate, where others might say that she was sharp and critical. So he said that his opinion was that she had not actually escaped the consequences of past abuse, and that many of the people who claimed no effect from past trauma were the ones who would be most adamant and the most rigid in their daily lives. The issue that this brings to us is what he calls a theoretical concern, because he wants to know what is the nature, extent, and basis of personal and physical healing in our day-to-day life. And he says, of course, the issue is a bit too large to address in this chapter, but he does give us a few examples here to get the wheels turning. The first example is that healing your internal world, whether that is through spirituality or other inner work, does not lead to what people might want to call sinless perfection in this life. So we are not seeking perfection here. We know that we are humans. We cannot just argue away what happened in our past, because things that did happen in our past are not just erased and no longer play a role on our life at all. We do have to understand that we bring those things forward with us to some degree, because that is the information that we're working with. Even if we look at brain scans, when people are shown photos of things after they have been through trauma, there's often still an effect there that's playing out, even if they don't notice it. His second example here is that the quote normal process of healing involves things that can be dramatic and mundane. So we may go through these huge life-changing moments that before this we were one person and after this we're another person. But we also have these just everyday moments of healing that remind people and remind us that we are human. We're not here to be perfect, and we can go through these experiences and have examples of how we can connect with others, how we can work better with others, and show that work of healing through us. And again, this is whether you see it in a spiritual point of view or just as an inner work, we're all interconnected point of view. He says that spectacular change in one area does not negate the need for increased change in the same area or in other related areas. So just because there's been healing in one area does not mean that it's absolute healing that we may never have to revisit ever again. His third example here is that healing work produces crippled warriors who are used because of their brokenness, weakness, and powerlessness to help meet others where they're at and help bring them forward too. So again, spiritual or not, we can see that if there's a struggle-free existence, we're not really going to attract many people to us who we can connect with and say, hey, I've been there also. And so a lot of these healing approaches that assume that the past damage is just removed and never spoken of again kind of makes it harder to relate to people and harder to be human and say, hey, you know what, we are going to go through hard times. He says that the healing path is paradoxical and that we're drawn to our spirituality or our sense of inner work and healing because we want life, and we want life that is more abundant. And a lot of times this path of abundance will be through tapping into brokenness, poverty, persecution, things that have really hurt and we've had to grow through them. This causes us to lose ourselves in a sense so that we can really find ourselves and figure out what our strengths are and what we are actually equipped to help others with. Sometimes this is an unexpected process and we may not choose this path that we're on, but ultimately it brings us to say, hey, I'm stronger for this and I made it through that. So he says for these reasons, he would argue that change is possible and it is substantial, but it's not going to be made perfect in this life and something that will just be completely erased from us and completely forgotten about. Because he says that the wounds of living in a fallen world with fallen people, meaning in a place that is not perfect and the humans here around us are not perfect, it means that us having bumps and bruises along the way leads us to looking at this evidence of internal damage. The evidence shown on the outside of the damage that was done by sexual abuse or abuse, he says is evident in two broad forms. Number one being secondary symptoms such as depression, sexual dysfunction, and number two, the typical way that the abused person relates to others, so the patterns that they show relationally. The style of relating to others is often the primary arena where the damage of abuse is lived out in a daily discernible form. So he says, of course, this does not mean that the nature, extent, and severity of the damage will be the same for everyone who has been abused. In many cases, the abused victims will not reveal secondary symptoms for a long time, but the symptoms can pop up or they may worsen later, especially if we're going through periods of loss or of stress or of repetition of past abuse dynamics that trigger these in us. He says that symptom-free abuse victims rarely actually escape the effect of abuse in their style of relating. So even if they have no symptoms on the outside, you can often see what they're struggling with on the inside by noticing how they relate to others. The effects of their relational style are often destructive and result in another series of problems that provoke secondary symptoms. He says that in either case, it's not unusual for the victim to overlook the connection between the symptoms or their style of relating and the history of past abuse. So he went through all of his case files over the course of a year, and he said he worked with 30 women and 15 men during that year, and 26 out of 30 women had been sexually abused, and 8 out of 15 men had been sexually abused. But not a single one of those people had come to him because of sexual abuse or to acknowledge it or to wonder if it had any sway on their current problems. In half of those cases, clients had remembered the abuse, but just viewed it as an unpleasant memory of childhood, similar to breaking a bone, and they didn't place any relevance to their current struggle in life. He said a lot of times the inability to see this connection is not because there's a lack of information, but an absence or a lack of clarity in the memory. And so when he starts working with people, a lot of times they don't really remember past abuses and past hurts in as much detail as one would think. He says that sometimes people may remember bits and pieces of it, and sometimes they may not remember any of it at all. But in the work that he does with clients, he says that counselors, pastors, or even close friends can sometimes come to suspect that abuse may have been a factor behind the internal or external struggles in a person's life, even if they're not initially reported or remembered. So he says that in order to see the potential signs of abuse in these symptoms, you have to know what to look for. And significant signs include things like depression, sexual dysfunction or addiction, compulsive disorders, physical complaints, low self-esteem, and particular styles of relating. Each symptom must be understood as potentially related to abuse because it is possible to struggle with one or more of these symptoms without ever having experienced abuse. So you've got to have a balanced perspective of not believing that every single personal or relational problem is the result of abuse, and then also not being naive about, hey, there is a high level of incidents and consequences of past abuse. So we don't want to view everything through abuse-colored lenses, but we also don't want to say, okay, well, abuse doesn't happen that often, so that's probably not a problem here. So he says that his attitude is not to assume more than he is allowed, given the data, but he also wants to be aware that abuse is a lot of times ignored or forgotten. So he tends to follow his hunch if the patterns of abuse are consistently presented through their symptoms, their complaints, and their relational styles. So starting with depression, he says that depression is often described as learned helplessness. The symptoms of depression include a despondent view of oneself, the world, and the future. The depressed person has little hope for understanding, help, or change. It is not uncommon for a depressed person to feel that the weight of the world is on their shoulders and that no one is either able or willing to assist them in their struggle. Those who are unfamiliar with depression are often surprised by the depressed person's swing between feeling helpless, alone, and unworthy to feeling cheated, abandoned, and angry. He says this swing corresponds to the difference between self-centered and other-centered contempt. He says depression can be understood as absorbed, self-annihilating hatred toward the soul for feeling alive and then being disappointed. The person who struggles with chronic hopelessness often lived in an abusive environment that made the expression of longing, disappointment, and anger dangerous, if not impossible. So the swing between having hope, like maybe dad will be happy with my report card, and then down into disappointment, such as he didn't even notice that I made 3 A's, opens the door to frustration, anger, and rage. Those emotions, most often associated with a sense of injustice, are dangerous because the expression of anger might elicit even more profound abandonment or abuse. What is denied in depression is the accuracy of one's intuition that injustice has occurred, the legitimacy of one's longing for justice, and the knowledge of what would right the wrong. Even if it was something minor that happened, if we swallow these over a long enough period of time, we get into this sense of learned helplessness because we figured out there was nothing that we could do to make it better in that moment, which is what we actually wanted. So this produces a rage in us, and the rage is turned inward, but it also causes us to subtly attack the people who perpetrated the damage. So depression, he says, is kind of a selfless selfishness or a selfless revenge. So the self is annihilated. A sense of injustice and longing for what is right is forsaken. But those around us are also made impotent to stop the downward cycle of our despair, and hopelessness, which could be looked at as revenge. He says that sexual abuse is often the foundation of the shame associated with longing and the contempt related to failure. It's quite common for depression to mask recalled memories and inhibit the return of new recall. Depression is often a cycle that many abuse victims pass through before major memories return. A lot of times, if something pops up that we remember or we think, okay, maybe I should deal with this, we may fall into depression as kind of a defense mechanism against it. One woman spoke of having depression as sort of a payment for her trying to remember her past. So he says the depression is a mask that can cover the real struggles of the soul. And so in order to properly treat and overcome this depression, we have to make sure that we're not missing the dynamic function of the symptom and what it's actually helping us protect ourselves from. Another thing to look for is sexual struggle. And this is what a lot of people come to expect as a symptom of people who had sexual abuse occur, but not every abuse victim will struggle with this. Some people will, of course, have been able to reclaim pleasure, reintegrate their body and soul. And on the other hand, many will struggle because their soul was absent during periods of abuse and they learned to lock away that part of themselves. And so maybe they've been able to perform and feel intimacy for many, many years, but then something happens that triggers them to come back to themselves in a sense, and they realize, oh, wait, this is not actually fulfilling for me. And so partners may say that something happened and my partner just completely lost interest. And this is a struggle that's new. And he's saying that that's often not a new struggle. It's just built up residue that comes to the surface because you're either in a safe and hopeful environment and can look at that, or you had something happen like stress or loss that triggered that to come back up. The key phrase associated with many sexual problems is a lack of interest or disgust. So a man or woman may have little or no desire for sexual pleasure, even though there is ability to experience arousal during sexual contact. And many people may say, my spouse is a good lover, but I get bored, or this isn't quite what I thought it would be. And he says that this could be the soul's quiet rebellion in order to help us avoid the hidden memories and vague feelings that were stirred during sexual contact and arousal. He says that disgust, on the other hand, is a more pronounced and active defense. So disgust can be directed toward the sexual act, toward the sexual partner, toward a specific person, toward an entire gender, and it could be toward your own body for feeling aroused. We also have sexual perversions here, like fetishism. He says a lot of times these are also correlated to abuse. Not every time, but sometimes it is worth looking into. Of course, sexual addiction is another topic he discusses here that is a probable, not definite sign of past abuse. But he says that all compulsions, no matter if they're bizarre or destructive, they all provide a context to find relief and to work out revenge. So relief, of course, is the easier of the two for us to comprehend because you can get a sense of pleasure and it helps you feel better, regardless of the compulsive act. This could be going shopping a lot. This could be maybe you're addicted to soda and you love the carbonation and you love the taste of it. Any addictive mechanisms here, we get a sense of relief from it. But he says that sexual addictions, promiscuity, and perversion can also be ways of expressing revenge. And this is working out the deep soul hatred toward others or toward yourself. He says that revenge exacts a sort of payment against the perpetrator of the past harm and the victim for what she views as her supposed cooperation or ambivalence about the abuse that occurred. Sometimes the symptom pattern is more connected to self-contempt versus other contempt, but a lot of times you'll see both being played out in the same behavior. He says that sexual dysfunction or compulsiveness is often a sign of undealt with rage, and the rage is worked out through self-centered contempt or other-centered contempt. But in order for the rage to lose its compulsive edge, you have to expose it for connection to the past abuse. So you've got to get to the understanding of why it's there and what you're so angry about, or it will keep popping up and informing the behaviors that you're exhibiting. He says, for an example, a woman who has little interest in sex will need to admit that she is taking out some sort of revenge on the male species or on a specific person, even if it's not just her husband, and of course not meaning to do this, but she's also gaining a sense of relief because she's having to avoid, or she's helping herself to avoid, something that is an unpleasant internal reality for her. And being able to acknowledge both sides of this and say, hey, this is okay that you're doing this. There's a reason why you're doing this. He says that now you could view this problem as something that you can deal with and handle and cope with versus just something that's wrong with you or something that you cannot change. Then he moves to compulsive disorders. So he says the same dynamic of relief and revenge fuel other familiar compulsions as well. We mentioned substance abuse, alcohol, eating disorders, workaholism, perfectionism. He used bulimia as an example here in the book. And he says that it fits the relief and revenge model of compulsive behavior. He goes into quite a bit of depth about bulimia specifically, how there's a strange combination of relief and revenge found in the process of purging. He says that hidden away in a lot of bulimic people's fantasies is that they will be purging something vile and shameful along with their food. And so they're trying to get something out of them. And yet a lot of times their day will actually revolve around thinking about food and obsessing over when they're going to eat again or how much they did eat. And he says it makes this really difficult to have interpersonal relationships because imagine what it's like to come second to food in a relationship with someone who's obsessed with it. This is not to shame the bulimic person, but it's to say this is an example of how these compulsive behaviors can disrupt your relationships with others and how you can find pleasure and enjoyment in life. There's also a sense of self-hatred here and ambivalence that can turn into self-shame because a person could say, I hate that I'm doing this. I hate that I'm binging and I hate that I'm purging. But there's also some enjoyment to it because it brings a sense of control and it brings a sense of relief. So he said this is a very good example of the relief and revenge dynamic. Next, we go to physical complaints. He says, of course, it's been known for a long time that the division between body and psyche is not real. So, of course, there are differences between the two, but we are a whole being. and it's very complex. So he says sometimes it seems like the body is warring against the soul, and we will have physical armor that protects against memories, and we may have a rigid, exhausted frame. He says there are physical symptoms related to stress, but a lot of times he says related to trauma, that include ulcers, intestinal problems, lower back aches, stiff neck, tight jaw, chronic headaches. He says, of course, physical symptoms are not always related to a history of abuse, but if you've had severe pain for a long time and you've been treated for it and it hasn't done anything to help it, you could start looking into this from a perspective of probable past abusive trauma. Next, he talks about self-esteem, struggle with a poor self-image, or its counterpart, narcissistic grandiosity, is another common feature of an abusive past. So the picture of oneself as weak, stupid, naive, worthless, or stained does not produce a life-giving, love-giving, accurate self-appraisal. And so the symptoms of a poor self-image are most often unseen and can only be inferred by observing a person as she relates to others. A common element will be the presence of strong self-contempt. So someone who undercuts, devalues, and sabotages her life and deeds is a lot of times a person who has had a past that pollutes her pleasure and discolors every gift given to her. And she will often feel unworthy, guilty for any kindness that's shown to her. And he says that she'll have an unnerving quality of being able to snap defeat from the jaws of victory, meaning a lot of times there could be a pessimistic attitude here or a way of looking at things half empty. This moves us to the style of relating. He says that all of the symptoms described here have common dynamic and behavioral components, but the differences between people who have similar symptoms can be profound. And so it can be difficult to draw conclusions based on this because everyone is so different. But we can draw helpful conclusions if we see each symptom from a larger perspective, which is one's style of relating. A style of relating is the characteristic manner of both offering and protecting oneself in social interactions. So how do we show up to others? How open are we? How open are we to receiving? How do we protect ourselves? He says that this could also be called one's personality if the term denotes a flexible array of behaviors that are used habitually in dealing with both our internal pain and our external circumstances and relationship. So he does not mean personality like you would go and do a personality test and that's just who you are and it can't change. He says that he's looking at the notion that people are not just who they are and people don't have to just understand and accept that. He says that we can actually change our style of relating and therefore change our personality through a concept that he will discuss more in chapter 11. But the question here is, why is our style of relating so important? And he said, simply put, it is the primary X-ray that tells us the condition of our heart. What we believe is expressed best in the way that we live. The best way to know our attitude towards ourselves, towards love, towards a higher purpose, is to look at how we deal with ourselves and with others and everyone who is here as a part of that higher purpose. Do we love selflessly, passionately, and boldly? Or are we committed to self-protection and to the autonomous oath that we will not be hurt again? So the next chapter is going to describe these defensive styles of relating, and that will conclude chapter 8 for this week. As usual, if you have any questions, please email me, ashana@yournorthstarrising.com, or you can drop them in the app. And if at any moment this gets to be too much for you, please take a break, take a breath, and know that you're not alone and you do not have to continue if you do not want to. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here.